Привет всем, меня зовут Cameron. This is the channel for английский с English Me on YouTube. Today, I'm going to do another quick lesson on ought to, which is something a lot of people I teach typically don't understand or haven't heard or don't know how to use. So, how do we use it? It's a lot like should. It's a lot like should, but not exactly. So the first example I could do for you guys is, let me just give you several examples. She ought to call her mother. He ought to run to school. I ought to find a better job. They ought to get out of there. We ought to buy a new house. And let's say he ought to try harder at his job. Okay, so you can see a pattern here. So pretty much you're saying ought to do something. So ought to do something. Okay, so you're doing something, another verb, right? So she ought to call her mother, right? Ought to, and then you're saying call. Okay, so to call her mother. Ought to call, right? So kind of divide it into that. So ought to call. Let me do a different color so it's more clear for you guys. The blue. So ought to call her mother, right? He ought, once again, to run. 1 second here, guys. To run to school, right? So you got the verb here, and then you have ought here. So it's like should. It's like you should do something, right? So to give you another example that's similar, you can say, she should call her mother. So it's a very similar meaning to this. But here, it's not she should to call. It's she should call her mother. Okay, so one has the infinitive. One is to call. She ought to call her mother, so to. And then with should, it would be she should call her mother. There's no to. There's no to there, so it's not the infinitive. Okay, that's the difference. So ought, we use like should, but you have to have the infinitive. To call, to run, right? She ought to call her mother, meaning she should call her mother. He ought to run to school, right? I ought to find, right? The infinitive again, right? To call, to run, to find a better job. They ought, once again, it's pronounced ought. Oh, wrong color, wrong color. Always goes crazy, this program. Anywho. So that's pretty much it. It's pretty straightforward. The main example I want to show is that once again it is a lot like should. It is a lot like should. So to put it really clear for you, she should call her mother. Okay, so call is just call here. All right, and then we have she ought to call her mother. Okay, and then you have ought instead of should, right? So let me show you should as well, right? And then you have to call is the difference, because with ought you need to use the infinitive. She ought to call her mother. Okay, it's the same thing. He should try harder in school, for example. And he ought to try harder in school. Once again, the difference is really clear, right? So you have should try harder. Try doesn't have to. It's not to try, it says should try harder in school. And he ought to try harder in school. Okay, so you see the to there. To call, to try, ought to call. Okay, that's the main difference. One is infinitive with ought, and the other is not the infinitive. Okay, should call, should try, should walk, should run, should think. Okay, so should is always like this. You don't say should to call. Неправильно. Okay, should to call, it sounds really weird, so don't say that. Ought to call, ought to try. Okay, try it out. It's pretty high level English, but it's a common mistake and a lot of people don't understand it. So just remember, that's what ought means. It's a lot like should, and always remember to use the infinitive. So that's it for today, guys. Спасибо большое. Check out our channel on YouTube. Subscribe, put a like, comment, and all that. Okay, it's английский с English Me on YouTube. So thank you very much, and have a good night. Спасибо.